from extreme medicine to extreme disease. The last talk, one up, Lori. The last talk, and certainly one of the most powerful talks 5 years ago at the second TED Med conference was by Lori Garrett. I had just read her book, the first book, The Coming Plague, and it was just shocking book to read, and I assume many of you have read it. Historical chapters in it about the 25 million people who died of influenza. Huge numbers. A couple chapters that talked about Ebola. The headlines in the paper today about the monkey disease, but it doesn't have anything to do with monkeys, or maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. She's an editor-at-large at Seed magazine, who is the sponsor of our first break this afternoon. And just a few days ago, she came back from China, where she had been looking into SARS. So, Lori Garrett.
Hi there. I'm not going to risk using that remote. I'm going to sit right here, stare right at my computer, which is already in the wrong place and should not be on yet. Thank you. So it's a pleasure, and I know that there was some concern, you were probably sweating it, that I wouldn't be here, because I said I won't come back unless I think the epidemic's under control in China. So I might have still been there, but it seems they are finally getting SARS under some semblance of control. And I guess I should say to all of you, Happy Prairie Dog Day. Those of you that don't know what that's about, well, you're just going to have to be reading the science sections of your newspapers more closely. Also, I have to thank my old friend, Bill Hazeltine, who gave a wonderful opening talk. When we first met, more years ago than I think either of us would like to admit, we were both working on the very, very first days of HIV. And it was interesting to me that in his remarks, he never really said anything about antimicrobial drugs. And partway through the talk, I was thinking, well, isn't that a huge oversight? He's not said anything about antimicrobial drugs. What about fourth-generation antibiotics or antiretrovirals or what have you? And then, as he neared the end of his remarks, I was actually quite grateful that he hadn't given you a hype, some claim that we were about to conquer the microbes, the claim we've heard all too many times, each time proving to be wrong, an incorrect forecast. So, what are we going to talk about here today? Well, now we can go to the first slide, please. This is our old friend, smallpox. This is not monkeypox, which is in the prairie dog circulating here in the United States right now. This is, of course, a far more serious pox, but a not terribly distant relative of monkeypox. And in fact, when smallpox was finally eradicated in 1977, roughly, 78, the French stymied, it's true, it was the French, stymied attempts to grant the Nobel Peace Prize to the team of heroes, real, genuine public health heroes, who successfully conquered smallpox worldwide on the grounds that they could not completely 100% rule out that monkeypox or a near relative of monkeypox might not lurk in the natural environment, allowing a return of the scourge of smallpox. So it was precisely because of the thing we see floating around in the prairie dogs today that just reward was never given to those who fought to bring down smallpox. But after the anthrax attacks of 2001, there was a sudden awakening in our government that microbes were a problem. The Clinton administration had made microbial diseases, particularly HIV and emerging diseases, part of the national security threat apparatus. And so there had been a rather sophisticated national security infrastructure inside the CIA, National Security Council, and extending into a whole host of agencies, specifically to deal with the threat of smallpox or other microbial diseases. But that was allowed to be abandoned in the early days of the Bush administration because it was Condoleezza Rice's absolute belief, which she had written about extensively going back to her days at the Hoover Institute at Stanford, that there were no national security threats other than classic nation-state conflicts. So anything that didn't involve one nation being nasty to another nation was not on the radar screen until anthrax in 2001. And then suddenly it went 180 degrees the other way, with about $3 billion pumped into research and public health infrastructure. One of the things that woke the administration up was what happened the last time smallpox had surfaced in the United States, 1947, New York City. A tourist who'd been in Mexico and had unknowingly contracted smallpox came to New York and went to everything from the Statue of Liberty all the way up to the cloisters before dying of smallpox. And at that time, coming right out of World War II, the public health system was very strong, very powerful, and very deeply admired by the populace. Furthermore, it was well funded, and it had a very powerful set of public health law behind it. That's why, in just 6 weeks, they were able to vaccinate 6.5 million New Yorkers who obediently stood in these lines waiting for their smallpox vaccination. Even now, with the many drills we've had and having made supplies of smallpox vaccine adequate to cover the American population, there are very, very few people in the public health infrastructure in this country who believe that we could repeat this feat today for a whole host of reasons. So our state of readiness is not terrific. And with that sort of lingering in the back of your mind, I want to take you completely away from this and go to a totally other situation, but ask you to be thinking, as I describe what's happened this spring in China, what would be different about how we would and would not respond here if, instead of the incredibly lucky situation we've had so far, we never had a secondary transmission of SARS? But what if we'd had one of those super spreaders? And what if, in fact, we'd had an outbreak, a Toronto-style outbreak or a Hong Kong-style outbreak of SARS in a major American city? How would the way the Chinese responded be much different from what we would do here? This is Chow Tai Market in Guangzhou in southern Guangdong province of China. It's about an hour and a half, 2 hours by train from Hong Kong. This is a vast market. You're just looking at one of about 20 aisles in this marketplace, and the only thing they sell here is exotic animals for human consumption. There are, I counted, more than 120 species of live animals stored in cages, tightly jammed side by side, one whole species range jammed against another whole species range, some species that would be natural enemies stacked right next to each other in tight cages, most of them in obviously very poor health, bleeding and urinating on one another. This may explain why we've now, University of Hong Kong scientists have isolated the SARS coronavirus from a range of animals found in this and 2 other markets in the region. At first, it seemed illogical that they would find such a broad range of species, such as the badger here or the famous civet cat here. Why would they find so many species carrying the virus? I think it's not that they're all naturally carrying it, but the conditions under which they were stored in this market. And just one other comment to make. In the initial wave of infections, and of course I'm sure you all know by now, this epidemic's first cases that we know of were in November in Guangdong province, but were covered up by the Guangdong Communist Party authorities. And the Guangdong epidemic actually peaked in the middle of February, but was still only vaguely alluded to in leaks of information that came out through anonymous emails and tips It really wasn't generally publicly known that there was any epidemic afoot until Hong Kong cases started in late February and early March. We now know that in the first wave of deaths and cases in Guangdong province, 5 to 8% were chefs. And since the population is certainly not 5 to 8% chefs, that's a very strong epidemiological indicator, a clue. Furthermore, most of them were chefs working in exotic food restaurants that specialized in these sorts of species that ranged from, I saw everything from full-size African ostriches to American beavers on sale in these markets. The animals came from as far away as Burma, Vietnam, Siberia, and North America. And they were all, as I said, caged and packaged together. What they really had been doing all these centuries in these markets is creating perfect conditions for what we call zoonosis, the transmission of a microbial infection from one species to another, resulting in an altogether new disease in the second species. What's really remarkable when you go into these markets and see the conditions under which the animals are kept, and layers this thick of animal feces all aerosolizing with the humans inhaling them. What's miraculous is that this is the first time we've directly traced any outbreak to these particular markets. Undoubtedly there have been others. We just didn't know this was the source. Well, as I said, we didn't really become aware of the epidemic until things took off in Hong Kong. And to this day, the Hong Kong epidemic has a number of mysterious and unsolved aspects and dimensions to it that should serve as very serious warnings to the scientific community and the public health community worldwide, because any sort of hubris that would say, oh, well, you know, if there's an outbreak, we have the technology, we have PCR now, we have all kinds of real-time technologies, we can get in there and solve it like that. It's time for us to take stock and understand that is not the case. We still cannot really explain what happened in Amoy Gardens. Amoy Gardens is I know many people have the sense that when they've heard about it, that it's maybe a sort of a tenement building in which more than 300 people became infected with SARS. The infection spread was only stopped by evacuating forcibly everybody, placing them all in quarantine outside of the city of Hong Kong for 2 weeks, and then relocating them under intense observation. But it is no tenement, and it is not one little dinky building. All this complex you see is the Amoy Gardens. It is 19 36-story middle-class housing apartments with your McDonald's and assorted other shopping mall things all in and throughout. It is not unlike a host of apartment and condominium complexes you might find anywhere in the world, including right here in Philadelphia. But the bulk of the 300 plus cases occurred in one single tower and on two specific lines of apartments within that tower. To this day, it's not 100% sure what happened at Amoy Gardens. The dominant theory put forward by epidemiologists working for the Hong Kong Public Health Authority involves this strange plumbing. The thing about plumbing in a lot of even extremely wealthy buildings in South Asia is that it's external to the building rather than somehow hidden in the walls as we would do here or inside the building. So these are right on the outside where you can see them. And the culprit, according to, do you have a laser pointer? Is it possible to grab? I just want to make sure everybody can get the idea. The culprit, the theory, involves a couple of findings. One was, thank you so much. One was discovery that there are at least two forms of the SARS disease. We're all very well of the respiratory disease, and that's what everybody's heard the most about. And for most people, particularly Americans, people in the wealthy world, what's frightening is a respiratory infection because you feel you have no control. And you feel somebody could just, random stranger could cough on you walking down the street and you could get infected. That's certainly an exaggeration, but nevertheless, that's sort of the root fear. But there's a second route of exposure, and a whole disease course that was discovered as a result of Amoy Gardens. And that involves a GI tract infection. And it may or may not have any respiratory secondary presentations. It's primarily a GI tract problem with a fecal transmission shedding of virus. So the belief is what happened in Amoy Gardens is that your index case staying in Amoy Gardens had acute diarrhea. He was a renal patient who'd been treated in one of the hospitals in which there was SARS and presumably gotten infected in hospital. So that's also not 100% sure. And the theory is that he was passing virus into the central sewer line, and the way the buildings were designed, there was another set of outpouring lines that came from the shower and the sink and so on, the toilet, and they would come down into this U-tube. And the U-tube was supposed to have a little water in it so that nothing from the sewer would back up and go back into the apartments. But there'd been a water conservation effort in Hong Kong. So the U-tubes were dry. And some studies, once the people were evacuated from the building, in these bathrooms showed indications that there'd been fecal aerosolization going back up into the people's apartments. But even then, we're not sure. And one of the things I find curious and I felt never was explained by this theory is that the bulk of the cases in the Amoy Gardens Tower turn out to be above the index case, which didn't really fall suit with the idea that the fecal transmission is going down. An alternative theory that is strongly believed by the residents of Amoy Gardens has to do with a very complicated way that the elevators were designed, which ones would stop at which floors, and the possibility that the index case and then subsequent cases contaminated by him had fecal transmission via their fingers onto the elevator buttons. Whatever the case, what this means is we still don't really know all the ways that human beings can get this new disease. The impact of SARS cannot possibly be overstated. While the numbers of cases and deaths are still remarkably small, when you're here in the West, the whole time that you were nonstop Iraq TV coverage, Asia was nonstop SARS coverage. There were actually networks created that were 24-hour-a-day SARS news. And the people here don't really use cell phone text messaging very much, but, you know, I'm sure de Quervain syndrome is a big problem in Asia because everybody is text messaging all the time. And one of the things that was going on was lots of people were sending terrifying universal text messages that would go out to every single Chinese cell phone owner, telling them things like, this is serious, they're moving SARS patients today, the air will be bad, don't go outside. Signed, a doctor. And what happened? Nobody went outside in all of Beijing that day. If you see the cumulative total of all this, you begin to understand why. One recent estimate from a group at Harvard is that the cost of the SARS epidemic has already been $100 billion to the global economy. I think it's much worse than that. Just today I clipped from the paper that both Nokia and Motorola are reporting 25% off, I believe it is, in their estimated sales and so on because of the SARS epidemic having kept so many Asians from shopping for so long that they couldn't sell cell phones. To give you an idea of the impact, this is the Forbidden City just before the peak May Day tourist time, when normally, according to the guards, they would have sold 80,000 tickets a day. I took this picture on the day that I bought at 3 in the afternoon, ticket number 100. And as you can see, there's nobody there but this employee. Throughout the Forbidden City and other obvious sites, if you saw anyone, they were like this young man. There was widespread belief that one needed to wear masks all the time, even outdoors, even in the park, even when nobody is around. Somehow the virus was in the air. Somehow it's like the miasma theory of disease never went away. And again, I have to ask you as I go through this, don't think, oh, you know, look at how crazy the way these Chinese people were reacting. Think, how would people react right here in Philadelphia if this all happened tomorrow? How different would it really be? As I said, outdoors, you're going to see people with masks everywhere. This is Tiananmen Square, famous for the 1989 Tiananmen massacre, of course. Normally, Tiananmen Square on a beautiful Sunday afternoon would be absolutely packed, just jammed. But the only people you see in this picture, with possibly the exception maybe of this foreign couple, are all employees, either in the form of cleanup personnel or spies. Tiananmen is always full of spies ever since the 1989 massacre. They just write down the names of anybody walking through. Even on the Great Wall of China, I went when they had sold only 200 tickets average a day, and you would get out in the middle of nowhere on the Great Wall of China and people would have masks on, and even latex gloves. So they had enough courage to leave their home, unlike 99% of the populace of Beijing, for example, but not enough courage to stop and think, am I really going to have a virus come flying out of the Mongolian wind across this mountaintop and into my face and give me SARS? As you got into places like Shanxi province, in the remote rural areas, the numbers of visitors, tourists, everything became sparser and sparser still, so that entire regions of China have ground to financial halt and stayed that way for weeks and weeks and weeks. This tiny cluster of tough Chinese tourists were the only people visiting these 5th century Buddhist cave carvings, which again normally is a mecca for tens of thousands of people per day. Every effort was made to convince people that businesses were safe, that you could come in, and in fact, typically I had my temperature taken 10 to 12 times a day without my permission. I had no right to say no, by restaurants, by gas stations, by hotel entries, by stores, everything. And typically I was the only one not wearing a mask wherever I went. The double mask was very popular. If one layer of safety would help, maybe two. And then you've all seen these designer mask covers that would be put on over the double mask, so you had three. And of course, the real problem here is anybody who has cardiovascular disease or respiratory problems is going to be in very difficult shape with so many masks on. When word got out that the proper mask was the N95 United States OSHA approved mask, that became something that one would get on the black market for $100 or $200 each. Now, the key to China's method of controlling SARS, once they admitted they had it, which they didn't do until April 20th, keeping in mind it started back in mid-November, once they admitted they had it, it was classic China mass mobilization response. 1, fire the Minister of Health. 2, fire the Mayor of Beijing. Why those two? Well, let's see, the Minister of Health is the personal physician of Jiang Zemin, the former leader of China and the leader of the most conservative, traditional, hardline part of the Communist Party. So if he had to go, the only way to keep peace in the party was to also off the mayor of Beijing, who's tied to current president Hu Jintao. And what we saw very clearly playing out in China was a conflict between the two political halves of the Communist Party, which directly affected the public health response at every level, impeding an interest-free response. So the Hu Jintao faction said, okay, first thing we're going to do, we're going to ban this year's May Day holidays, which traditionally are the biggest holiday 2-week period in all of China, when millions and millions of Chinese go somewhere to see relatives, take a holiday, what have you. We don't want them spreading SARS. So everybody please stay put, don't go anywhere, let's not spread SARS. So what that meant to the 120 million migrant internal workers who typically on any given day are on the move in China right now, from the rural areas into the urban areas for work, what that meant to them was, they're going to declare martial law. They're going to shut down the city. Now, mind you, the government has no credibility if you're Chinese. They lie to you all the time. So when these little text messages were going out saying, martial law will be imposed this weekend, everybody ran to the train stations and fled Beijing en masse. And hundreds of thousands of people fled the big cities, particularly Beijing, which of course meant that they took SARS with them. A lot of them were university students Beijing is the center of most of the universities for all of China, and the universities were in fact placed under quarantine, and some of them were in fact shut down. And just before that happened, anticipating it would happen, thousands and thousands of college students jumped on trains and headed to the outer provinces. Again, this all seeded SARS all throughout the country as a result. The epidemic came at a time when, though China is on a pell-mell course of development, and certainly is the fastest growing economy in the world, with Beijing alone having had an 11% quarterly GDP growth last year. There's no place in the world that can come close to that. But the government's notion of infrastructural development in the time period of great wealth is that you develop that which will bring more wealth. You do not spend the money on things that do not create immediate wealth. So they're spending on highways, they're spending on dams, they're spending on electricity and so on, but they are not spending on public health, medical care, and the like. And in fact, they've been reducing spending and increasing the amount that the individual Chinese citizen has to put into it. This is the Beijing Center for Disease Control, and prior to SARS, just a few months before, all it was one of many thousands of local so-called epidemic control stations that are all over China, and their primary task is giving immunizations to children and making up numbers to send them up to the upstairs commands to show that you're doing a good job in your community. And overnight, the Beijing CDC had to come to act sort of like a real CDC. The national CDC was even worse off, because less than a year ago, what it was a Department of Health a Department of Infectious Diseases inside of a second-rate university in Beijing. And they had no federal employee equivalent of our CDC. These folks were inventing the CDC on the fly as the epidemic was unfolding. Creating work areas, building laboratories, trying to create an infrastructure out of nothing. Certainly they would have been able to get their epidemic under control faster if they hadn't been working under such primitive conditions. For the first time in the history of China, they did something that we do routinely every time we have an outbreak in the United States. They set up a hotline where people could anonymously and safely, without risk that they would get jailed for saying the wrong things under a communist dictatorship, could make phone calls and ask, is it true that I should throw my neighbor's pets out the window, as thousands of people did, because they carry SARS? Should I, or shouldn't somebody come exterminate my neighbor's cats and dogs? If I have a fever, does that mean necessarily it's SARS? Could it be something else? And so on and so forth. Also, as part of their mobilization, they realized they didn't have enough hospital space to hold acute respiratory patients who were contagious. And I would argue that there's not a city in the United States that has adequate negative air pressure rooms in which respiratory care can be meted out in an intensive care setting without risk to the health providers and to visitors and to other hospitalized patients on the kind of scale that they were dealing with in Beijing in the peak 3-4 weeks of this epidemic. So they had 4,000 workers mobilized, and in 6 days they built a 1,000-bed hospital. And this is what you're seeing. And these workers were amongst those 120 million migrant workers. They literally slept on the job. Because they were worried about contagion spread, they wouldn't let the workers leave even to pee or go to bed. This is the resulting hospital facilities, which included these double lock window passages so that the doctor could open this up, pass through medicine or food, close it, and then the patient has one on the other side to open to minimize the amount of possible spread of microbes. It looks great, but it's actually only 2 layers of aluminum with a piece of styrofoam in the middle. Those are the walls. Quarantine was used as a key tool throughout Asia and is still being used, obviously, in Toronto and Taiwan right now. Quarantine means in the case of Beijing, they would never tell us, ever, and they still, as far as I know, have never told WHO how they went about determining that this building should be quarantined and that one should not. I would find buildings quarantined that had only had 2 cases of SARS, and then I would find a building that had had 20 cases and there was no quarantine. So it clearly had a lot to do with who ran the building, whether or not a Communist Party official lived in the building, things like that, and a lot less to do with what you'd like them to concentrate on. Whole hospitals were placed under quarantine, including the leading infectious disease control hospital of Beijing, of all China. And then in what I think was just purely public relations move, they handed out these disinfecting cans to janitors who went around disinfecting, the grounds of the Forbidden City and the Summer Palace, as if SARS would somehow be right here in the ancient cobblestones. Finally, they put up decent infection control stations inside the train stations and airports where people in these white suited outfits would check for fevers, and they instantly people invented various sort of thresholds that one would walk through, and as one passed through it would send off flashes like a metal detector does, indicating if you had a temperature over 39.2 centigrade. Outside the city, as you hit the village and rural areas, the people took the law into their own hands. These folks, for example, were manning their own little village quarantine center. The sign tells no SARS allowed, and they literally allowed no one except a village resident into their village. This occurred all over China, and so that wherever I went from province to province, I found these little ad hoc barriers set up. And of course what this did was, again, paralyze the economy and increase a sense of fear in the general populace. There were more official quarantine and fever check stations set up eventually everywhere, so that now you cannot drive a distance of, say, 100 miles without being stopped and submitting to a fever check every 5 or 6 times along the way. And in addition to taking your temperature, they're going to spray disinfectant all over your car or your truck. They're going to make everybody get out, and they point these little guns at your forehead to take your fever. If you have a fever, then you're in trouble. I actually had a situation in Hebei province where they misread the fever gun and said that I had a fever of, what was it? Anyway, it was something, I should be dead, basically. And immediately, I had to submit to a second form of thermometer that would take 3 minutes, and sit down, and everybody backs off, and people are putting triple layer masks on and getting further and further away. And I kept saying, I feel fine, guys. Your thermometer's broken. Fortunately, I was right. Had I been wrong, I would have lost all personal liberty and have been immediately taken into custody, and God knows what would happen from there. China, of course, has taken the brunt of all castigation related to this epidemic, I think deservedly so. And in order to try and reverse international opinion, they very publicly started staging events to try and show that they were getting things under control. This happened to be a day when they were going to release some college students who'd been in quarantine for 2 weeks, who then were rather happy to be able to leave their dormitory. The idea was if the students got out and it was shown live on national television, the whole country would decide the epidemic was probably over. And as you see, none of these kids are wearing masks. It worked. By the very next day, people started going outside. They took the masks off, and they stopped being scared. The virus, however, obviously hasn't gone away. The fact that the virus has been found in so many species of animals, whether it is all simply a matter of cross-contamination in those exotic food markets, or it represents a more ubiquitous level of viral infection with this coronavirus in nature, regardless, it means that this virus is going to come back. We will see it again. The Chinese method of control is a mass mobilization method, and therefore it's not sustainable. What they're not building up is an infrastructure, a permanent infrastructure of public health. That is the very thing that we did not build up until we saw anthrax, and that in most of the countries of the world today has been allowed to deteriorate. And it's without that sort of permanent response that we all remain vulnerable, that we will constantly have viruses play surprises on us and appear at times when we least suspect it, and we will have, whether it's in a capitalist country or a communist country, we will have local officials who think that covering things up for the sake of economic or political good is smarter than being transparent and saving the lives of the global community. So SARS has given us a big lesson, and the question is whether we're ready to really listen to it and take appropriate action. Thank you.
So nice to see you again.
You want a hug? A SARS hug.
A SARS hug. Okay, good to see you. She's written a couple books. The first one must be in your library, though. If you don't have it, get A Coming Plague, because it's really a basic book on our planet, and you really should read that book. I think it's a terrific book.